We'll go to our first and only public hearing, proposed amendment to an existing Class 1 historic designation for the building and the grounds that we are in, Palm Springs City Hall. Staff report, please.
Yes, Mayor Pugnier, members of the City Council. In October of 1996, the City Council designated City Hall, Palm Springs City Hall, as a historic site Class 1. And in the Council resolution, you see language in the middle of page 27 that identified that the building was subject to review for any changes or alterations, and there was no mention of the site. And on that basis, staff concluded that the building is the only portion of the property that is protected under the current designation. When the Historic Site Preservation Board considered this issue in March of 2010, they initiated amendment to extend the designation to include the entire site, especially the landscaping and parking areas, and the Historic Preservation Board recommended to you in their action of May 11th, 2010, to expand the classification to include the entire site. Staff has analyzed the project a couple of different ways, how much the parking lot and landscaping is related to the building architect, whether there's a relationship to a prominent landscape architect, design significance of the parking lot and landscaping, and the significance of off-site views, and also reviewed some changes to landscaping that has occurred over time. As a result, staff is recommending an alternative to the HSPB's recommendation of the entire site, and that is to recommend that the concrete steps and entry plaza in front of the main entrance to City Hall and the council chambers be designated Class 1, but not the entire site. You have a resolution from the HSPB for the entire site, beginning on page 13. Staff's recommendation is found on page 10 as a draft resolution. And that concludes staff's report. This is a public hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Ewing. I think we've got, in my mind, before I open the public hearing or listen to my colleagues, there's sort of one fundamental question as we go through this, and it is what happened in 1996, and if in fact that we think something occurred in 96 which made the entire site Class 1 is kind of a moot point, and if we don't, then we're moving on for the discussion. So. Ms. Fote, followed by Mr. Lewin, before we open the public hearing. Questions of staff?
Yes. I have a question which is kind of more of a broader question, and that is we have boards and commissions that we very carefully appoint, spend a lot of time interviewing them and asking for their expertise and advice. And so it always troubles me when we get a report from a commission suggesting one thing, and then we get something from staff suggesting something totally different. And so that's been bothersome for me for a while. And in this particular case, I'd really like to know why we got a different recommendation. What was the rationale for a different recommendation from staff, which I'm sure that staff presented their ideas at the commission meeting, and obviously was not accepted by the commission. So why do we then get a recommendation from staff? Is there something that staff felt so strongly about that they chose to not go along with the recommendation?
Well, I've been before you on the question of does staff follow the commission or does staff exercise independent judgment? And as you know, the policy in the planning department is when the commission or board has final action and something is on appeal to you, staff will carry forward the recommendation of the decision-making body. But when the decision-making body is only adopting a recommendation, such as a change of zone or an amendment to the general plan, or in this case, a historic site preservation board, staff feels freer to exercise independent judgment, and that's what you have here. We did not see that there was adequate information to justify including the landscaping and parking lot as being historic. And that's really where we differed from the HSPB. And you have all that information in the staff report.
Yeah, I think I'd like in the future for staff to take that really very seriously, because there seems to be no point in having commissions if you've got staff, which is one or two people making a recommendation that's already been vetted by 6 or 7 or 8 people, and the same findings not being found, except in a case where something is egregious, then which I don't think this was. But anyway, my other point is, in this list of things of all of the sites, going back to what the mayor was saying, that were designated on in, 96? I've lost that date. 96. Have any of those properties come in for alterations to the land, and have they had to go through the Historic Site Board?
I don't believe there have been any since I've been with the city. Before that, I do not know.
And so when the Lowry House came in, I believe, to do a pool, and they had to have historic site review on their land, that would have not clued us into the fact that the entire resolution of the city council of that time included the site. It would seem to me that it did for me, that they had to come in. And so the ramification of tonight's vote for me would be also, if we do not find that in the 1996 resolution that the land was included. As it says to me, a site means a site, it doesn't say a building, but if we find that it is, can you tell me how that would affect the rest of the properties that were done in the same resolution?
Well, I'm not sure what action you're referring to that you might take. The resolution is on page 48 of your staff report, Resolution 18907, and the resolution, Section 4 on page 49, includes all of those properties that says no exterior alteration to the Frey House 2, the Valley Station, Lowy House, Palm Springs City Hall, and the Carrie Perosi House shall be granted without prior approval. So this is the basis this was the council's action, and whether it was intention or not, we can't determine, but they focus on the buildings, not on the sites. There's no discussion of the sites as being protected under the resolution. I conferred with the city attorney on this when we first came up with it, because there is a lot of background that discusses sites as well as buildings, but the council's action, and the city attorney confirmed with me, was focused on the buildings, and that was the basis for our conclusion here.
But my question is, if we were to vote tonight that it's just the concrete pad for City Hall that we're voting on, what does that not put all of the rest of the sites, the Frey House, the Valley Station, the aerial tramway, the Lowry House, and all of them that are listed there, don't we also vote then that their land is not included in this? Because if we don't accept it that the City Hall land was included, then how do we accept that the land was included, and we've already had one of these properties come before the Historic Site Preservation Board for a pool?
Well, the city attorney may need to help out here, but the only thing you have before you on the agenda is City Hall. So if there is a determination that you are working from the position that only the buildings are protected, and you want to amend the protection for City Hall, whether that can be extended to the rest of the buildings in this ordinance tonight or not, may be beyond what's on the agenda. I would ask the city attorney to give us some guidance on that.
The only item that you do have before you tonight is the City Hall facilities, and if the council wished to make it clear that these particular properties also included the site, then it would be appropriate for the council to initiate appropriate proceedings in order to deal with that issue, if you wish to do so. But
for me, if we're saying that it didn't include the site, and we're having to vote just on the concrete, then it means to me that it didn't include the site in any of them. And so what I'm asking is this not, we wouldn't have had to vote on this if the site was included.
Well, and I think the problem goes to the fact that this particular resolution was, and I've read the staff report that you're referring to, and I can certainly appreciate and understand why, when somebody reads just the staff report, one might think that what was being applied here was the entire site. But when the action itself is very clear that it doesn't deal with the site, it only deals with the actual structures, then that's what created the problem or creates the confusion. And I think that what we need to do is to get council direction as to where it wishes to go in regard to declaring what that intent is, and make sure that the record reflects exactly what the council wishes to achieve. But this thing, when it was adopted in 1996, is not consistent with what some of the supporting documentation would suggest.
And I've read through all the supporting documentation, and I can't find anything that says the site is excluded.
I understand that. My problem, though, is that as far as a controlling document as to the official record as to what the council did, has to be the resolution, not what the staff report and some of those other documentations are. And so it's incumbent upon us as staff to make sure that the resolution reflects the action that the council took. And it may very well be that this council is going to say, well, in our opinion, that's what should have happened, and that's what needs to be done. And I would be recommending, if that's what the council wishes to do, and to make it very clear that the City Hall site means the entire site and not just the buildings, that out of an abundance of caution, you also request that we initiate proceedings to make that very clear for the other sites as well.
Okay, I guess I'm not being clear, because I'm really not getting an answer here. I don't understand if this council tonight votes to just do the concrete, that in essence says to me that the rest of the sites that were included, the rest of the buildings that were included in the 1996 resolution do not have their sites protected.
Potentially, that is an interpretation that one could construe from that action. However, those particular items are not pending in front of you, and if the council wishes to resolve any potential ambiguity that might be here, it would be incumbent upon council to give that direction at the end of the proceeding. But as it stands right now, you have one item before you, and if the council concurs with the staff recommendation and wishes to do what it did, you're absolutely correct. It could be construed that the rest of those properties only apply to the buildings and not to the entire sites.
And it could be equally construed that it did apply to the site, since one of those properties had to go before historic site preservation to have a change on their land.
Okay.
That's neither here nor there.
Okay, well, we're going to get to the public hearing, too. Councilman Lewin.
Thank you, Mayor, and thanks for raising this issue. I really enjoyed this because this was like trying to interpret the Constitution. What was the original intent? And so I wanted to share with everyone here what I saw in reading this. I looked at our original document, and I want for the public to understand, even if a site is historic, whether it's the entire property or the building, modifications can still be made. We could add on a wing to City Hall if we chose to, correct? Or I guess, Mr. Ewing, that would be correct? We could add a wing to City Hall if we needed to?
Subject to all the review requirements, yes.
Okay. So it's not like it's a static thing. So I looked at the ordinance, and 8.05 is really clear. A structure or a site can be designated as historic, Class 1. And I looked at the resolution from 1996, and it doesn't say Class 1 historic structures. It says sites. That's what I see. It says sites. And more importantly, when it gives the description of the 5 or 6 properties, for City Hall itself, it lists Lot 16 and the entire APN number. The thing that the council voted on was the entire APN number. So when I asked myself, what did they mean? Well, they used the word site, and they defined it as the entire lot. And that gave me a lot of clarity in my thinking of what was already decided back in 1996. And then when I go to the staff report that was given to that city council back in 1996, they literally say that the Class 1 designation will apply to the structures and their sites. It's illuminated in the staff report. It will apply to structures and their sites for these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 properties. And so, barring hearing anything else, I feel like they decided in 1996, and I would like to see us reaffirm that. And I'd be willing to consider that maybe some portion should be declared unhistoric in the future if we needed to. Thank you.
Okay, so we will, any other questions of staff before we open the public hearing? Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Ginny. Seeing none, we'll open the public hearing. We have 3 speakers. Barbara Marshall. Barbara, you'll be first. Gary, you are second. And then Ron Marshall, you are my 3rd speaker. Good evening and welcome, Ms. Marshall.
Good evening. Good evening, Mayor, City Council. I'm Barbara Marshall, and I'm a full-time resident of Palm Springs. Regarding the item now before you, it's important to realize that city staff created tonight's drama. In passing Resolution 18907, the 1996 City Council intended that significant changes to 6 Albert Frey designed sites be reviewed by the HSPB. There's no drama in that. That is what the HSPB was created for. The HSPB is a board that you appoint and a board that you can overrule. I was serving on the HSPB when staff was directed by the board to initiate the designation of the City Hall site. The board was motivated out of a collective frustration that it had been deliberately circumvented regarding the proposed changes to the City Hall parking lot. I mention this because I believe it is important that you understand that the resolution before you is far from the HSPB's intent. The resolution before you still does not include the City Hall parking lot. The staff rationale for this omission is a diagram from writer Joseph Rose's very abbreviated summary of Albert Frey's work. You're supposed to believe the extraordinarily foolish notion that Albert Frey never produced any additional drawings of City Hall that included the parking lot. I can't express to you the profound personal frustration I feel when I see city staff working at cross purposes against a city board that is sincerely committed to implementing a city program for the benefit of its citizens, or how one sentence of clear direction can be transformed into 70 pages of gobbledygook. Particularly frustrating is that this rather suspect interpretation of what constitutes the City Hall site was never returned to the HSPB for discussion or approval. One would think this would be a basic courtesy given to any board whose direction has been so grossly transformed into something that was obviously not their intent. At a minimum, I would hope that you would do what the city staff should have done and return this resolution to the HSPB for discussion. They can then discuss the lack of merit of this latest city staff interpretation. Thank you.
And thank you, Gary Johns, Ron Marshall, then Chris Menrad.
Good evening. I am Gary Johns, and Barbara Marshall is a tough act to follow. 2 years ago, on February the 8th of 2010, a group of concerned citizens, including myself, appealed the planning director's decision to make changes to the City Hall site. The Planning Commission heard our appeal in September of 2010. Various arguments were made regarding unnecessary cost and the importance of maintaining the historic hardscape. But one of the most compelling arguments made was a procedural one, that the City Council Resolution 18907 already protected the City Hall site, and that the planning director should have sent the project to the Historic Site Preservation Board for review. The planning commissioners upheld the appeal unanimously 5-0. In his comments, Planning Commissioner Bill Scott, since retired, concurred, in quotes, wholeheartedly with the argument that it was his understanding that the resolution already included the site. Tonight, I would ask you to support the Planning Commission's decision of 18 months ago. The proposed resolution before you confuses the issue. Please deny the proposed resolution and reaffirm the 1996 City Council's intent that protects the City Hall site. Thank you.
And thank you. Ron Marshall? And then Mr. Menrad will be my final speaker.
Good evening, Mayor and City Council members. I'm Ron Marshall from the Palm Springs Preservation Foundation. Happy Modernism Week. Hopefully you've read our January 13 letter. It's buried on pages 71 and 72 of the staff report, but I'd like to make a few additional points. When the 1996 City Council approved Resolution 18907, they were told by the Planning Department that, quote, the recommended Class 1 designation protects the architectural and historic integrity of the sites, in that the sites and their structures may not be modified nor objects removed, unquote. I'll say that again, quote, in that the sites and their structures may not be modified. Not the building and the concrete plinth, rather, quote, the sites and their structures. Incredibly, that important piece of information and the core of the issue before you has been conveniently left out of the staff report. You'll only find it in our letters, and never is it rebutted in the staff report. Further, the staff report before you says that we are expanding the definition of City Hall site. That's not true. As we have contended for more than 2 years, the entire city site is already designated by Resolution 18907. The amendment before you actually, in fact, shrinks the scope of the designation. Another convenient omission in the staff report is that the staff report fails to tell you how Resolution 18907 has been implemented over the last 15 years. The 6 buildings and sites designated under the resolution have had changes made to them time and time again. A list of those precedent decisions would convince you that this resolution works perfectly well. In fact, over the last 15 years, minor changes to the City Hall site have not gone through the HSPB, and that's perfectly appropriate. However, I would submit to you that the average man on the street would agree that bulldozing and reconfiguring the City Hall parking lot constitutes a pretty significant change to the site. And also, just a matter of clarification, the Tramway gas station just had the signage 100 feet away from the building and the architectural lighting a few dozen feet away from the building, reviewed by the HSPB in just the last couple of years. There's a famous quote that says, progress is to simplify, not complicate. This amendment is not progress. It creates a major policy complication that will take years to sort out. In conclusion, we don't need a resolution that doesn't need fixing. We don't need to fix a resolution that doesn't need fixing. Excuse me. Resolution 18907 is straightforward and almost elegant in its simplicity. The words are not lacking, only the human implementation of those words. So I ask you tonight to receive this, shred this, burn this, whatever, but please don't pass it. Thank you very much.
And thank you. Chris? Mr. Menrad? Good evening.
Hello. I'm Chris Menrad. I'm the president of the Palm Springs Modern Committee. And I wanted to bring up in cities nationwide and formerly here in Palm Springs as well, historic designation is defined as designation of an entire site. That includes the land and everything built on the land. A perfect example for Palm Springs is the city's designation of the Santa Fe Federal Savings, which included the entire site, the building, surrounding landscaping, and the parking area. A poor example, also here in Palm Springs, is the Oasis Commercial Building, where the city designated only its second story. Because of this decision, there's a potential for the building's ground floor and patio areas to be completely altered despite its status as a Class 1 historic site. So it's actually rather confusing for an owner or an investor what they're getting involved with in that particular building. In any event, we urge you to formally and officially codify that all Class 1 historic sites are defined by the entirety of the property, the land, and everything built on the land, as indicated by the assessor's parcel number. Thank you.
And thank you. Mr. Stone? Okay. And if there's any other speakers, Mr. Stone will be my final speaker.
Mayor, council members, good evening. You may not know that in a what seems like now a past lifetime. I spent 15 years working for the federal government, and the last 8 years that I spent in government service was as a staff analyst. And one of the things that I was required to do every day was produce staff reports. So I have some idea of what constitutes a good staff report. A good staff report is concise, it is not verbose, it contains all of the options available to the decision makers, it makes a recommendation that is fully supported within the body of the staff report itself, and it does so in such a way that nobody's going to end up with egg in their face once the decision is finally made, and that all the decision makers are fully informed. I don't think that this staff report constitutes good staff report by any possible definition of the term, and I'd like to point out some of the problems with this staff report. First of all, the original resolution is there, and then in January, when this first came to City Council, there was a resolution number 33A. This was ultimately deferred and put back on tonight's agenda. And on that agenda, number 32A, it said that the HSPB recommended that the historic Class 1 designation for Palm Springs City Hall include the concrete steps and the plaza area in front of the main elevation. That was not the recommendation of the HSPB before this came to Council in January. On the same document, and this is on page 44 of your staff report, there is a whereas that says, the resolution adopting a historic designation, Class 1 for the Palm Springs City Hall building, but excluding the sites and grounds. There is no documentation in this staff report whatsoever that the site and grounds were excluded in this designation. Moving forward from the back, we come to the new resolution 33A from the HSPB, what was included in this agenda, and this says that the HSPB decided that the Class 1 designation for City Hall should include the entire site of Palm Springs City Hall, which was the recommendation of the HSPB. How it got changed with no additional hearings is a mystery to me. Then in the second whereas, which the first time around said the city in their original designation excluded the grounds, the second whereas has been revised to say that in the original designation for City Hall, the Palm Springs City Hall building was designated without specifically including the entire site and grounds. So it says, they didn't say one way or the other. In the current version, they have once again reverted to the first wording, which says the site and grounds were excluded. The missing document that is so important in this is the one that Councilmember Lewin mentioned, which is the October 2nd, 1996 staff report that was forwarded with the resolution. You got the resolution in your package. You did not get the memorandum, which says, as Mr. Lewin pointed out, that the sites in that and their structures, the structures and their sites may not be modified. It's a very clear intention of what was the decision of the planning director in 1996 and the recommendation made to council at that time. I don't think anything needs to be done with this staff report. I think the designation of what is and was not, what was and was not designated is already clear from the public record.
Thank you. Seeing no more speakers, we will close our public hearing. Council. Was that loud? Oh. I had to wake her up. All right, Mr. Mills.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I want to first start off by saying I've been around here a long time. I was on the Planning Commission and worked on the Historic Site Ordinance. I was on the Planning Commission that approved it and sent it to Council. I was also on the Planning Commission in 1996 that reviewed the designation of this building. And I'll tell you exactly what the conversation was. And it doesn't make any difference what was in the staff report. The staff report is one thing. It's the resolution, it's the ordinance that was passed, not the staff report. And it specifically says building. And the idea was that, and perhaps it isn't clear as to what's the difference between a site and a building. A site could be a building. Site could be the lot for that matter. But the reality of it is, you have buildings that are not on their original site.
we have several buildings in this town that we have designated Class 1, that their site is nothing like it was for the original building. So how can you automatically say that if you designate a Class 1, you're designating the site when it's not the original site? And that's why when we structured this, the intent was that you identify the building as being historical, you identify the building and the site as being historical, if that's what needs to be done. They were intended to be separate. They were always intended to be separate, and I'll admit that that it could have been structured better to make it understood that you're not approving one with the other. Clearly, the resolution of the City Council is building. It says building, and the reason that the council, and I don't remember when it was, a year and a half or so ago, the reason we pursued the modification to the frontage City Hall that we did was the council made a determination at that time that it was building. The council, sitting at that time, a year and a half ago, said to staff that their interpretation was that it was building and not site. So, and then we went along the process, and then there was an appeal to that. Craig can probably explain it better than I can, but there was an appeal to that by HSPB, which is certainly fine. But I think it's important that people who weren't here when this was put together don't understand the intent, interpret it the way they want to interpret it, need to understand that there was a different interpretation when this ordinance was put together. Doesn't mean it was right, doesn't mean it's wrong, doesn't mean anything other than that. But please understand that everything is not tied to the site. And that you can approve one, or you can approve the other, or you can approve both. And the HSBB, in my mind, if they feel the site is historical, when they recommend the Class 1 designation, then they should say that. They should say building and site. And that would make things a lot clearer, and that was a way that in the original intent and trying to put this together was that we visioned it, that there were some buildings that made sense to designate. The site either didn't make sense, it was too far gone from what the original site was, and that you could never bring it back to what it was. But there is a distinction between the two. And at the time in '96, again, no matter what the staff report says, the council is not voting on the staff report, they're voting on the discussion that occurred at the time. And the way the ordinance is written reflects that. And like I say, having been there, I know exactly what it was about, and it was separated for a reason. So, however this ends up, I hope we go back and look at our HSPB ordinance and take care of some of these little issues that are starting to cause problems that don't need to be caused. And so I know Craig is looking at that. But as far as this goes, I think what staff has proposed is including the pedestal, if you want to call it that, which has already been altered, which is not the original pedestal as it was before. The front doors of City Hall are not where they were initially. There's been modifications occurring all through here. Is it worth trying to keep future modifications from happening? Yeah, I actually think it is. And I like the fact that staff has included this in here. Is the parking lot worth the designation of a Class 1 site? I doubt it. I don't think so. It doesn't make sense to me to designate that parking lot as historical. And if you look at the original building, you look at the original photographs in here, that parking lot doesn't look like it The parking lot that's out there was not the parking lot that was originally done with this building. There have been modifications to this building itself prior to its getting its class 1 that I hoped wouldn't have happened had we had a class 1, which really prompted us to get the class 1 and to get the ordinance in place. So I hope, and I hope we can go back and make modifications to the ordinance, but it was never intended, nor does it say in our ordinance, that when you designate a building, you designate a site. They were always intended to be separate. They have, the interpretation since then has been that they aren't by HSPB, and I don't think that's right. But I do agree that it needs to be, we need to sit down and modify so there's no misunderstanding of what is getting to Class 1. So, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
And thank you, Councilman Mills. Councilman Hutchison.
Thank you, Mayor. I think that it would benefit City Council and it would benefit the city when making decisions about City Hall to have the input of the Historic Site Preservation Board. It was very, very interesting, the staff report that went before the HSPB and the work that was done in the HSPB's discussion, and to my mind, that did place a great emphasis not just on the building per se, but on the perspective of the building and being able to see the building and being able to appreciate the fact that the building sits on several steps, and so we do need to take in consideration not just the building, but the views of the building. And for that reason, as I think is well discussed in the material that was the HSPB discussed, I do think it makes sense for the entire site of City Hall, which is one of our spectacular mid-century buildings, to be Class 1 now. And so I will support that in terms of a vote. However, there's a completely different question, and that is, do we make changes to City Hall? Do we make changes to the parking lot? I'm by no means convinced that the present parking lot configuration needs to remain that way for all time. However, whatever we decide to do or future city councils decide to do, I do believe we should get the input of the HSPB, and then the city council has the ability to say, yes, we agree with whatever HSPB's view is, or no, we disagree, we're going to make this change, or we're going to accept the change that is recommended. So to me, it's a fairly simple matter. That is, let's get the insight of the folks we've appointed to HSPB, and then if there's disagreement about that decision, it can be appealed to City Council, and City Council can make the final determination, which, as Councilmember Lewin pointed out earlier, we can make changes to this building and other buildings if that's ultimately what the Council decides to do. So I would support making the site a Class 1 historic site so that these decisions would reflect input from HSPB going forward. Thank you, Mayor.
And thank you, Councilman. Mayor Pro Tem.
I would like to make a motion that that this council reaffirm resolution number 18907 and express that the word site includes both the building and the land that the building sits on.
Is there a second to Ms. Vogt's motion? And then further discussion? You want to hit your motion button too, Jim? And a second by Councilman Lewin. Discussion, further discussion? Mr. Mills.
I'd like a better understanding of exactly what that motion is saying.
What I'm saying, to avoid the same confusion that we're having with City Hall for all the buildings that are listed in the resolution number 18907.
What page is that, Jen?
That's page number 48.
That's 96.
48 and 49. I would like to affirm that the word site in all of that resolution include both the building and the land, as I believe it does. and to clarify that for all of those properties so that we don't have this issue in the future.
Mr. Ewing.
If I might direct your attention to Section 3 on page 49, I don't know that we get the clarification we might be looking for. Look at Section 3, subsection A, the last sentence. This is for the Frey House, too. It says, "The site is located on Lot 10 and a portion of Lot 8." We don't know what the portion of Lot 8 is. Under B, the last sentence is, "The site is located on a portion of Section 7, Tract 4," and we don't know what portion is. They aren't defined anywhere. So the issue of site isn't resolved by upholding, it's not clearly identified yet by
Okay.
upholding the old ordinance. So
All
there's
right,
there's a
then-
lot of work that still has to be done
All right,
on
then
that
if I
basis.
just take out in this motion the word "a portion of," and then it becomes the site.
We don't, it's still not defined. We don't know where the boundaries of the site are
Well, we
based
know
on
what the
this, based on this
boundary-
resolution.
We know what the boundaries of APN 505020012 are.
We do, but the site is located on a portion of that APN.
But
So,
it's not located on a portion of any other APN, so
but does that mean that entire APN, which could be many acres in some case, always subject to HSPB review when there's going to be any kind of activity? It's not clear that
So then I would ask the city attorney to give me some language for that would make that clearer. I'm just trying to get rid of this ambiguity that we have, that I believe now exists on all of these buildings.
I think that without mapping specifically what the relevant portions of the land are around the building and adopting that map, that ambiguity remains. We would need to do a little analysis on each of those sites and have you adopt a boundary of the site within the portions that are
I
not clear.
think, Jenny, it might be easier to give direction to the staff to bring that back and deal with this issue now, because you don't want to make a potential problem bigger. Let them clean it up and just deal with what's on our agenda. I
And,
think
Mr.
that-
Mayor, and I would also
Yeah.
recommend that we also need to make a corresponding change to Section 4, also to convey that particular intent, or to make sure that intent is clearly delineated.
We need to bring some language back.
Well, I'm more than willing to have it come back with clarity if that's, if that's what the city attorney and...
And I think there's a majority on this issue, and I see folks shaking their head. Jenny, it might just make it a little bit simpler. Okay, because I think we at least head in the right direction. Mr. Lewin, followed by Mr. Hutchison, followed by Mr. Mills.
I don't think it's as ambiguous. I could be wrong. It says the site is located on Lot 10 and a portion of Lot 8. The comments that I wanted, so maybe we do have to look at it. I agree with Mr. Mills that there's a problem with the ordinance and how things were written, and we need to be tighter with it in the future. But the ordinance does have the option to say structure or to say site. And the failure then, if Mr. Mills is correct, was not using the word structure throughout the ordinance. It's hard for me to interpret this any other way than site when I've got legal descriptions in the word site. So going forward, just direction to HSPB, and staff, if they feel that it's just a structure, I think that it should be very clear. Otherwise, it's hard 15, 20 years later to deny that it said site. And I'll be willing to wait to hear from more.
Okay, Mr. Mills, followed by Mr. Hutchison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would, and the reason I pushed the button was because of Ms. Vogt's motion, and including these items in here, is that some of these sites were with, well, I think maybe all of them were with support of the owners of the property. And if And I'm not so sure that they understood that the designation of their property was for site and building. So if we're going to do the research here, I suggest that we get back to the property owner to make sure they understand that the designation that we may be coming with the Class 1 is including their site, and give them what those limitations are, and let them understand either they're going to agree or they're not agree. Doesn't mean we can't do the designation, but we always like to do it with the support of the property owner. So that's what I was going to say in an effort to ask
Right.
Ms. Vogt to remove
Okay,
the motion.
another good point. Mr. Hutchison?
Yeah, I agree with your comments and with Mr. Mills' comments. I'm perfectly willing to say that the council resolution in 1996 was imperfect, and let's clean up that with respect to City Hall tonight, and then we can, after appropriate staff work and consultation, deal with the others.
Okay, Ms. Vogt.
And that was exactly what I was going to say, that I will now make another motion that we hereby declare the site, because, I mean, the reason I want to do this is because that parking lot needs to be paved, and we need to do that as soon as possible. It's really hazardous out there, and it looks terrible. So I will make another motion that we declare the site of Palm Springs City Hall without the APN numbers to be an historic site, and that we go in the future do the research, as Mr. Mills has suggested, on the other properties to clean up this whole mess.
And Mr. Lewin, you were the second to the original. You are still there. Do you agree with the changes in the first motion to this subsequent motion?
Well, I just want to make sure that won't eliminate protections for the other 4 or 5 houses. I'm unclear on how.
No,
that
it
would affect them.
was with the request that staff bring back the information.
Then I'd be fine with that substitution.
Okay.
If I may,
Yes,
the
Mr.
direction, we would need to bring back a new resolution for you, so the motion we would receive as direction to prepare a resolution to designate the City Hall site, and we would bring that to you at your next meeting for review. We don't have that resolution in front of us right now, if that's acceptable.
I disagree with that. I'm sorry. I thought we're reaffirming something, not creating a new resolution.
Well,
about City Hall.
there's probably a legal process that Mr. Holland can help us with.
And I think also what we are also looking for is to modify Resolution 18907 to reflect what the council has, I think, directed as the intent and consistent with Mr. Mills' direction or suggestion, which I thought was concurred in by most of the council, is that we would notice the current property owners of that desire or intent to move ahead with ensuring that the entire sites were designated.
And so we would bring that same resolution back, or the only thing we're altering is the city hall, including the site.
See, we're trying to get to the same place, and is the bottom line. And I know where Paul's coming from, because after reviewing all the information, the additional information that came from members of the community, it's not an easy issue, because it was kind of messy back there in 1996. And we have to look at it as if we weren't there, because we weren't there. And what is it looking at the data? If I were just to look at it, looks like, what was approved in 1996 is, to me, that was their intent, so it's a moot point, like I said at the beginning of it. So it's either, yes, going back to reaffirming that or setting up something new. We're getting to the same point, that the site. So whatever you think legally and in a legislative process, so we don't mess it up for another council that, is here in 10 years, they want to put sustainable landscaping in there, it's got to be clean and the most efficient way. And staff, I think you need to tell us what is the most efficient way. Is it the way Mr. Ewing indicated it with Mr. Holland? And I think that the motion, the second, will probably follow that lead.
No, and what I'm suggesting is that in order just to make it very, very clear and to make sure that it's all done very correctly and it's very clear, is that we come back with a resolution that deals with City Hall, and we come back with an amendment to 18907 that deals with what was done then.
I just don't want the motion to be held up if one of those property owners decides they don't want the land.
And that's why I'm suggesting we still need to come back with the City Hall resolution as a separate deal. Hopefully, we'll have them both on the same agenda, and you can take action on both of them at the same time. But we will have the City Hall one on your agenda at your next meeting.
Mr. Mills?
I'd ask the motion maker to clarify for me what is site. Is it landscaping? Is it, I mean, I understand it's parking lot. I understand the hardscape standpoint. But is it including landscaping? Is it including lighting? Is it including, I mean, is it everything? So if, as the mayor mentioned, if we want to change out the landscaping and the planter out front, you have to get a HSPB approval to do so?
And that shouldn't be.
No, I don't think if we want to plant a rose bush that we'd have to go to HSPB, but I'll leave the wording up to the city attorney.
We have some work to do on this. If you look at page 9 of your staff report, the assessor parcel number for City Hall includes some frontage along El Cielo that is right-of-way. And I don't know that you intend that to be subject to historic review if it's going to be repaved or there's a curb cut. So we need to define site very specifically and give us a chance to bring something back to you so that you're getting what you want, no more, no less.
That's fine.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Lewin, and then you can decide whether you're still a second to Ms. Foat's motion.
Well, just to direct my thinking towards what Mr. Mills says with regard to what is it and does it include grass and flowers, on page 37 of the staff report, it really does say architectural elements, built items, and it includes location, design, setting, aesthetic effect, but it doesn't say trees. I mean, trees die. Grass dies and needs to be replanted. I haven't anywhere in my research seen that plants themselves are historic unless they designate a tree in some way. So that wouldn't be my understanding. Yes.
Yes, and there's direction to write the resolution, probably excluding the landscaping, lighting. I mean, I think we can pick and choose those when they come back. Okay. A motion, a second on the floor. We can vote.
Motion carries 4-1. Councilmember Mills voting no.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Mr.
And
Mills.
I want to emphasize or just explain my vote. My vote is not against the structure. It's not against the basic hardscape. I just don't feel that the parking lot ever was historic or should be considered historic in the future.
Okay, the record will so note. That concludes our public hearings, public comment portion of the meeting, members of the public. So it will be the interviews. We'll now interview 44 folks here in the large conference room at City Hall, which will be well noticed, and we encourage people to come spend the day with us. Okay, that's direction. There's no legislative item on there. 4B, determine Class 1 historic designation for Palm Springs City Hall. Staff report, please.
Yes, Mayor Punier, members of the City Council, in response to your direction on February 15th, 2012, we've brought back to you a resolution for your review and consideration with regard to the historic designation for the Palm Springs City Hall site. There's been a lot of discussion that you've engaged in with regard to what of the City Hall property to include in a designation. You see a recommendation from the City Public Works Department in the staff report that if the entire property is proposed for designation, that 5 elements be excluded from any regulation, and those are identified A, B, C, D, and E on the top of page 4 and on the exhibit on page 7. The recommendation is for the council to identify any portions of the property that it wants to not be considered for review, and based on that direction, the draft ordinance can be modified to reflect your action. You have already conducted a public hearing on this project, so you may have questions of staff, and we're available to answer them. And that concludes the report.
Okay, thank you, Craig. I'm sure there'll be a little bit of discussion on this item. Who wants to start? Ms. Vogt, followed by Mr. Moore.
My motion would be to just, see, I believe this was, the entire property was designated. So my motion would be to designate the map on 07 as outlined as a historic site map of City Hall. The only thing that means, I mean, it doesn't, I know we've not gone to the Historic Site Board for permission for the animal park and all, I mean, the dog park, but I think that those things are already done. I don't think we can sit here and pick and choose. The only thing that means is that if we decide to put up a new fence at the animal park, that it would go to historic site, and so I don't see why that's such a big deal. So I would my motion would be to just go ahead and reaffirm what was done and designate the property.
Mr. Lewin.
Well, as a compromise, I could see making some exemptions, basically drawing a line. Can I stand up here?
Absolutely. Wearing that new pin of yours, you can do anything you want.
Right here. Right along there, so we have a perfect square so that the site, excluding the cogen and the dog park, and excluding this area so that there's just not unnecessary bureaucracy there. Line right there and exclude landscaping under 5 feet.
Landscaping under.
All the shrubs and grass and flowers and all that stuff that naturally live and die. Wouldn't need historic site overseeing, seasonal flowers. Wasn't that one of your concerns?
Well, one of my concerns was if we want to change it out to sustainable landscape. I mean, there are pictures of this with, desert scape. I mean, and if there was ever a thought, which there was at one time, I still cannot believe we have those flowers that soak up all that water every single year at City Hall. But if we want to change out the landscaping in the front, I think that should be our discussion. I mean, in this case, it's over $1,500, which it would be. Correct me if I'm wrong, it would have to go to the historic site preservation, and I don't think that component should have to. So the landscaping has been one of my big concerns. I was hoping that we would have control over what we choose to do when we want to make it more sustainable, et cetera. But
So that's what I'm proposing is draw a neat square. And exempt landscaping. I think that preserves. Because the thing is, it really does the ordinance that was written originally, not the resolution, but really does say location, design, setting, materials. That is part of what we're talking about. And Mr. Wexler, the architect, isn't here tonight, but I had a long conversation with him last week. And his words were, I may not be the biggest fan of Frey, but absolutely the setting of that building on that site is part of what makes it important. And he made it very clear to me. And I think that drawing that square around it allows the views to be preserved from all sides, and only asks not to never change anything, but just a simple higher level of review before we do it. And that's what I would move.
excluding landscaping.
Excluding landscaping.
Okay. Do you want to hit your motion button? And we'll have discussion with Mr. Mills.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Paul, your request is to exclude C and D and stop at the northerly curb of the parking back there? Just follow the curb line?
Yes.
And then, would it be your motion, or could it be your motion to modify the boundaries on the other three sides to go to the existing street curb, not out into the street as we're looking at here? So just go to the curb face, or back a walk, or whatever you want to do, but anyway, it takes it out of the street, and it gets rid of that finger that goes up there on E. So you're just going to the curb proper that are adjacent to the City Hall property?
To the outer curb of the sidewalk, you mean?
Right.
That's what I thought it was, absolutely.
Okay. Then just a comment on in your discussion with Mr. Wexler. Nobody's ever talking about moving the site or moving the building. All we've been talking about is whether it's historic, and I think the staff's proposal last time was to include the steps around in front there as part of the site, but just to simply excluding the parking lot, which was not this configuration in the original design. Mr. Frey had no idea this parking lot was going to look like this. And, but, so, I don't get it. I really do not get making a parking lot historical. And so I won't be submitting it, or supporting it, but I'm glad to see you're being a little more reasonable. So.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mills. We have Mr. Hutchison.
Yeah, I support Mr. Lewin's suggestion. I think it's sensible with the landscaping you suggested, Mayor.
Okay. So we have a motion by Mr. Lewin, second by the mayor.
Motion to redesignate City Hall approved for 1 as amended to include sites A, B, and E on the map.
Thank you, council. Item number 4,